So we talked about Composer a few weeks ago. It's basically the de facto package manager for PHP. Uh, when we talked about it last, we were going over how to actually use packages in Composer. Today, I want to go over creating a package, getting it into Packagist, which is the kind of standard repository for the Composer community, and the problems that you might have with that, and why we might want to use that aspect of Composer instead of just consuming libraries other people write. So, to start with, I want to cover basically how we've done this kind of thing on previous Delta projects a little bit. So, in the past, we've relied on the version control system to allow us to share code between projects. The biggest examples of that are larger Zen framework projects, where we might be pulling in 15 or 20 different, what in SVN would be called externals, and in Git might be a subpath. Um, so for example, on the TitleNet project here, we've got these SVN externals, which this particular definition isn't used anymore because this project's been ported to Git, but this helps demonstrate the problem pretty well. These are all the different third-party libraries that get pulled into TitleNet. And there are a few issues with this. One is that particularly with SVN, this was very slow. And in Git, this was problematic because there's not really great support for it out of the box at all. It's not something that Git tries to solve. But beyond that, this doesn't really handle nested dependencies. So for example, Delta Zend in many ways relies on this third-party library called SWAT, which is a user interface toolkit.
I'm
There's
sorry,
no,
Brad.
yeah,
Can we make that larger?
yeah.
Thank you.
There's no way to really know that looking at this list, though. You just have to know to add all of these things to your project one by one. And if I add another dependency to Delta Zend, you need to know to add that to your application, either by talking to me or just looking at other projects by example. Composer solves a lot of those problems in the sense that it can traverse a tree of dependencies and figure out what needs to be installed. On top of that, it makes it very easy to grab stuff from third parties. So again, looking back at the TitleNet project, we see here that we've got basically a mirror of a certain version of Zen Framework in our repository. Uh, it's not really a great way to do things, and it makes it hard to keep up with updates. Uh, in some cases, you can point at the third party's version control system directly, but that gets pretty clunky too, and they become a single point of failure for your project. So this week, I converted Dewdrop, which is a library that we've been using for a little while now to write WordPress plugins in an object-oriented manner. I ported that over to Composer and got it into the main repository. So I'm going to go ahead and get an install started inside my Vagrant shell here. So I'm in the plugins folder of a WordPress install right now. That's just a fresh install, nothing in it really, just a sandbox. And I'm just going to make a folder for my plugin. And then, like we covered previously, you just need a composer.json file to say what you're going to use for this particular project. And in our case, we're actually pulling in Dewdrop. So now I've defined my dependencies there, and the next step is we actually need to grab Composer itself. All right. So now we've got Composer, which is distributed as a FAR, which is basically an archive of a PHP application. And one flag that's good to get in the habit of using is this preferred dist. And that basically means don't download individual files, but try to get like a zip of the release or like a release package from GitHub. So tying it back to the repository, you can download a zip or tar of tag 0.9.2, which is just going to be considerably faster. Composer itself is still somewhat slow. From what I understand, that's kind of typical for package managers implementing the algorithms that it is using. But in general, I found that after the initial install, things are pretty usable. Also, you'll see here that because I've installed these Zen Framework libraries and other apps, it's able to pull that version from cache, so I don't have to re-download it from the servers again. So it should move along pretty quickly to get through my dependencies. The thing to notice, though, is that I just had to say I rely on Dewdrop, and it's now figuring out what does Dewdrop rely on and pulling in those dependencies for me. So that's a much better user experience than the version control system kind of being kludged into solving that problem when it's not really designed for it. So now that we actually have everything installed, just a second here, I think we got one or two left. The first thing I really want to go over is just how this changes the layout versus our other projects and also other Dewdrop plugins. So we'll look at the district site versus this to kind of show some other advantages that we're getting from using Composer. So we've got everything installed now. Before we dive into the Composer-based file layout, I want to look a little bit at the district project. So the district is an example of something where there were limitations in WordPress that kind of prevented us from implementing Dave Hansen's original design. So we decided we were going to write a plugin in Dewdrop to kind of fill some of those gaps. And the plugin layout is pretty simple. So you see like admin, db, lib folders. The library itself is in the vendor folder. And we can see that we've got Dewdrop and then the Zen Framework 2 stuff there. Basically, Zen was bundled with Dewdrop. And Dewdrop was responsible for kind of managing itself, Zend, and any other libraries that we wanted to load. An example of that would be the autoloader that we shipped with Dewdrop. So this is basically a wrapper around the autoloader from Zen Framework 2, but we have to basically tell it, these are the different namespaces we expect you to be able to load in this application, or in this plugin in this case. And we have to configure that. In the case of Composer, it gives you an autoloader based on whatever libraries you've installed automatically. So it builds that for you. And in order to use it, you just need to require that autoloader. So we can see an example of that in Dewdrop itself in the test runner. If I go to the Bootstrap for the test, we can see here that it's just pulling in the autoloader from Composer. So that aspect of the code of Dewdrop just goes away completely. Another thing that goes away is the installer for Dewdrop. That's no longer needed because Composer kind of handles that responsibility. And we also had a task in the Dewdrop command line tool to pull the latest updates from Git for the library. And now we don't need that either because that comes directly from Composer. So that helps clean things up quite a bit. Additionally, I want to dig in a little to the composer.json for the library itself. So this is how we basically tell Composer what this library is. In this case, we give it the library name. We tell it there's going to be a command line application that ships with this. We tell it how to auto load. In this case, we're saying we're using the PSR4 standard for auto loading, which comes from the PHP Framework Interoperability Group. And then we let it know our dependencies. Based on this information, Composer is going to take care of a lot of other stuff for us. And to tie it into the official repository Packagist, we don't have to do a whole lot. Basically, you create an account at Packagist. and then you submit a package. In our case, so far, it's just the Dewdrop package. And we point that at the GitHub repository. On the other end, back at GitHub, we tell it how to send updates over to Packagist. So if I go into Dewdrop, go to Settings, there's a service hook built into GitHub for integration with Packagist. So if I go down to Packagist here, you can see that it's already set up, but basically it just needs your user, the API token from your account page. You can see here, and to be turned on. And then every time I commit to GitHub, it's going to push that over to Packagist at the same time. And every tag that I make in my GitHub repository becomes a release on Packagist for that library. So I don't really have to do anything to maintain this connection once I've just registered the GitHub repository at Packagist. And then once a project goes into production, I'm done with development, I just want to kind of keep things stable, I have the ability to pin myself to a specific version, or in this case, anything 0.9.x. So I'm not going to get a major upgrade unexpectedly, which has happened on some of our other projects where things, to make things easy, were just pinned to a branch or trunk. So for example here, just pinned to the new admin shell branch in Delta Zend. In this project, it doesn't look like anything is pinned to trunk, so we at least avoided that pitfall. But it gives you a lot more flexibility as far as the semantics of the versioning on the libraries that you're using. So basically, to set this up, and I think it's something that we're probably going to want to do for other things, including Delta Zend and some other internal libraries, you have the composer.json, and you either push that over to Packagist if it's an open source library, or you can add a different Git repository to your application's composer.json, and it can find packages there too. But basically, I want to try to remove this responsibility from the version control system and put it onto this package manager, which is a little bit better equipped to actually pull it off. So I think that's pretty much everything I wanted to cover. Any questions? Or do you guys want anything demonstrated as far as this setup goes? All right, I'll take that to mean that everyone is good to go. So I'll post this video, and for those of you who have worked on Dewdrop projects already, contact me if you want help kind of converting it to use Composer instead of the Dewdrop installer and all that stuff. It's a pretty small change, but it would be worth doing just so it's easier for you to follow new releases and things like that, because there's a lot of stuff coming in the near future here. So I think that's it.
A little something to share with the group. I think some of you
Cool.
may have seen this already, but paste a link into the chat here. This is a kind of a cheat sheet for the composer.json file. It's not all perfect English or anything, but it's pretty handy. I used it. It came in handy on TitleNet when I wanted to bring in the PHP geocoder library. That was really simple to do.
Right.
I needed to be able to configure the target directory for where the library ends up being placed, and so this little cheat sheet made that very easy to do for me. So thought it might be useful for others too.
Cool, yeah, I'll throw this in the notes in Basecamp for this review. All right, well, I guess we're wrapped up, so that was a pretty quick one today. But if you want to get a library put into Packagist, or if you just need help getting started with using the existing libraries, let me know. It's definitely something I want us to all be very comfortable using. It works very well inside the Vagrant environment if you're having trouble getting it running in Windows. So it's probably not even worth your time, really, to mess with it in a Windows environment. All right. So thanks, guys.
Sounds good. Thanks, man.
Later.